All right, so thank you, Jamie Judge, for coming out today and doing this program on New Jersey folklore. And I'm gonna pass it over to you and let you introduce yourself a little better.
Sure. Okay. So everybody, first off, thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. And Julie, thank you so much for putting this together. I'm really excited. It's a topic that I enjoy. I think it's a lot of fun, especially when it has that little bit of a local flavor to it. So my name is Jamie Judge. I am a history assistant professor at Rowan College of Burlington County, which is the community college that used to be Burlington County College. We just had a name change, but it's the same place. So what I want to do today is to first kind of talk to you guys a little bit about the history of folklore. Not too much, I don't want to belabor the point. But what's interesting to me about ghost stories specifically is that ghost stories are kind of like a subset of folklore. And folklore has been around tens of thousands of years at least. So I want to talk about what folklore is and what point or purpose it served throughout human history right up to the present day. And I think it's very easy for us to kind of get an idea in our head that folklore is something that's old, right? It's something that they did a long time ago, and it's not really something that we do anymore today. But I don't think that's fair. I think we do still do folklore today. We just don't call it that. So I kind of want to talk a little bit about that. We'll get into some ghost stories certainly afterwards. And I tried to pick a mishmash of ghost stories from all across the state. So I tried not to focus on one area too much. But let's kind of get into folklore itself. Let's talk a little bit about the history of folklore. So before I get into the ghost stories aspect of folklore, what I'll say here is that folklore, like I said previously, has been around for at least tens of thousands of years. Long before there was writing, humans had the ability to write languages. These kinds of stories are being passed down orally. And there's a whole bunch of different reasons why folklore stories were invented and why they kind of stood the test of time. Folklore stories, to me, are in a lot of ways what movies and pop culture stuff is for us today. In that you typically had either a hero or a heroine, and that particular individual was presented with some type of a major problem or a crisis or a dilemma. And they used usually their good traits to overcome that dilemma and ultimately come out on top, right? So for the hero or the heroine, they were able to overcome the bad thing, the problem, the evil, whatever it was that they were up against because of their bravery or because of their strength or because of their intelligence and their cunning. And the reasons why it's those traits specifically is because those are the traits that society wanted to reinforce in the people, right? It's the good traits. It's the stuff that you want to be, that you want to aspire to be when you grow up. So these stories obviously have a big impact on children. They have a big impact on adults and everybody in between. Now, certainly folklore stories were for entertainment purposes, but like I said, it was also to reinforce those good traits that society wanted. What's neat about folklore as well is that over time, as human societies slowly started to, break away from just living in individual small tribes to coming together and living in big towns and cities of a few hundred to a few thousand, to, city states, to nations. What we see is a bunch of different cultures all coming together and living together, right? And when a whole bunch of different cultures come together, it means that those cultures are going to blend, right? Some of your old characteristics, your old traits from your tribe are going to disappear, and your tribe is going to end up adopting some of the new ones. Part of why folklore was so important to people back during this time period as well is because it helped preserve some of that cultural identity. As more cultures came together and some of their own individual cultures were lost, it's the folklore stories that allowed them to kind of preserve a lot of that, to keep, some of the roots of what their individual tribes and their individual cultures, really valued and believed in. To me, folklore is just very interesting in that regard. In a lot of ways, it's a reflection of what was important to our ancestors. And we still see a lot of it today, like I said, in pop culture, from, TV shows to movies to comics, video games, and everything in between. Now, ghost stories are an interesting subset of folklore, in that ghost stories seem to be pretty universal. If you go and trace the roots of some of the oldest folklore stories that we still have, from all over the world, from parts of Asia, parts of Europe, parts of Africa, South America, North America, one of the key elements that they all kind of have in common is that all of them seem to have ghost stories, which is really fascinating and interesting. That's a commonality for cultures and civilizations that never had contact with each other for millennia. The fact that they all have ghost stories is very, very interesting. And in some ways, maybe it almost begs the question, are ghosts real? If so many different cultures have these stories built in, there has to be something to it, right? So ghost stories seem to have some common threads across the spectrum as well. A lot of these groups and civilizations kind of keyed in on why ghosts are ultimately here. And there was a few main reasons that most of the cultures seem to agree upon. First, they believe that ghosts are lingering spirits of the dead, that they are people who did not cross over to the next world for one reason or another. And there are a few different reasons for that. First, the general belief of why ghosts lingered here and didn't go on to the next world is because they lost something. There's something of value that they're searching for. And a lot of times you'll see or hear stories of ghosts that kind of stay in the same area that they died in. And that's because they may have, lost some type of an object that was very important to them, like say a wedding ring, a spouse, a child, something that was very, very important to them. Others kind of believe that ghosts are still here because they don't even know that they died. They don't realize that they died. And what we see is that they continue on with their daily routines, which is why you hear a lot of ghost stories of ghosts in, dining rooms or kitchens. It looks like they're kind of cooking or going through regular daily chores because they haven't realized they died. And a very small group also believe that ghosts are simply just malevolent spirits, that they are spirits that died with either hatred or vengeance in their hearts, and they want to exact that vengeance on anybody that they come in contact with. So part of my selection here of ghost stories that I've selected, yes, as I wanted to try to bounce it around New Jersey as much as possible geographically, but B, I think you're going to see examples of all different three of those types. So without further ado, let's get into some of these ghost stories. And the first one that I have for you guys is all the way up in the north in Warren County, and it's called Shades of Death Road. Now, Shades of Death Road obviously wasn't originally called that. Nobody would want to call a road Shades of Death Road, right? So the real name of the road, and it still has existence up there today in Warren County, is just Shades Road. It's just Shades Road. But because it has a very dark history attached to it since at least going back to the early 1800s, because so many deaths have been associated with this road, it kind of got a rather dark moniker over time of being Shades of Death Road. So going back to the early 1800s, when the road was being carved out through Warren County, anybody's ever been up in Warren County, or at least this area of Warren County, or if you've been on this road, obviously you would have experienced the fact that this road is not particularly well lit at night. In fact, it's almost not lit up at all at night. There are very few streetlights on this road. Compound that with the fact that it's a very, very wooded area as well. And the fact that the road is very windy, it has a lot of twists and turns through the woods, means that there is a lot of blind turns associated with it. And going back to the early 1800s, I guess a series of bandits, violent gangs in particular of bandits, kind of staked out this area of the road, realizing that these twists and turns made for these blind turns, and that was a really easy area to set up ambushes for people who were traveling on the road. These violent gangs would attack the people on the road, they would rob them, and more often than not, they would murder them pretty brutally. And it got to become such a bad problem for the area that people just started avoiding the road altogether. And that started to negatively impact the local economy of the people living in the area. So what the townspeople decided to do was to hunt down these bandits. And once they did finally catch them, they hung them all from the trees all along the side of the road. And part of the reason why they did this was to send a message that the road's safe to use once again, and also to send a message to any other potential would-be robbers that if you decide to use this road to attack people again, this is what's going to happen to you. More modern times, we see that the road has been the cause of many fatal accidents, car accidents more recently. A lot of people who've driven on this road late at night will tell you that under the best of conditions, it's a very, very dangerous road to drive on simply because it's so dark and because the turns are so tight and they come on you almost immediately if you're going at too high of a speed. What a lot of people also reported, which starts to get kind of interesting up there, is that thick fog banks seem to appear seemingly out of nowhere, like almost just instantaneously. These fog banks just appear, which makes the driving even more dangerous. Now, some people, while driving through the fog, have mentioned that they experienced weird phenomena. Some of the things that people have experienced is that their car was being chased by what they describe as a red orb. And that this red orb chased their car rather aggressively through the fog. And almost as soon as they exited the fog, the orb mysteriously disappeared. They could say definitively that it was not brake lights of a car that went by them, and that it was a red light that definitely pursued them. Now, some people believe that it is the spirit or the spirits of the dead travelers on the road trying to warn the cars not to go down that road because it's a dangerous path. Others believe that it's the more malevolent spirits of the former robbers and thieves and gang members that were murdered along the side of the roads, trying to catch some more of the people that are driving down that road. But regardless of your interpretation, Shades of Death Road is a very interesting story. And if you do ever go down that road in Warren County late at night, be careful because it's a treacherous drive. It is a very treacherous drive, like I said, even under the best of conditions. Okay, so our second ghost story of the day is referred to as Devil's Tower, which is in Alpine, New Jersey. Now, if you aren't familiar with Alpine, New Jersey, it's right across the river from New York City. So it's not too far away from it. Now, our story of the Devil's Tower starts in the late 1800s with a guy named Manuel Rionda. Now, Manuel and his wife were very wealthy landowners down in Florida, late 1800s, and decided that they wanted to move up north, just outside of New York City. And they bought this big piece of property on the other side of the river from New York, which I'm sure was prime real estate back then, as it is today. And they decided to build a dream house there. And this house was big, it was beautiful, it was gorgeous, it was everything that they wanted it to be. Now, what Manuel did was have a little bit of surprise for his wife. And what he decided to do was to, in secret, have a special tower built near the house on the property. And the point of this tower was to be for his wife so that she could go up there late at night and look out over the tree line right directly to New York City and have this beautiful view. So when they finally get up there to New York and they settle into their house and she sees this tower, she's absolutely overcome. What a wonderful gift. It's great. And she loved to spend time up on the top of this tower because it had such a beautiful view. Sometime over the next few years or so, on one particular night, Mrs. Rionda woke up in the middle of the night. And she, kind of felt around the other side of the bed and realized her husband wasn't there, probably working on some, project that her husband liked to work on late at night and whatever. It wasn't a big deal. So she decided to, go visit the tower. I can't sleep. I'm kind of awake and maybe some fresh air will do me some good. So she puts on her robe. She goes up to the top of the tower and she's looking out over New York City and just taking it all in. And after a few minutes of being up there, Mrs. Rionda heard some voices emerging from the woods. And after observing these two people that came out of the woods for the next few minutes, she realized that one of them was her husband, and that he was holding hands with another woman. And the longer she observed them, the more she began to realize that her husband was having an affair, that he had walked out of the woods with this woman, he gave her a big kiss goodnight, and then started walking back to the house. Mrs. Rionda was so overcome with anger and fury and sadness that broke her heart that she decided in a fit of rage to throw herself off the tower to her death. Now, in the weeks and months after Mrs. Rionda's death, lots of strange things started happening around the tower. People who were outside the tower late at night reported to see a dark figure walking around the top of the tower even when nobody else was up there. Other people reported to start to hear very strange growls coming from the tower that sounded almost like a wolf or a bear or something like that that was actually inside the tower. People also would hear random sound of a woman screaming. And people started to reach the conclusion themselves that this was the ghost of Mrs. Rionda. And that not only was it her ghost, but a lot of people started to believe that she sold her soul to the devil the moment she threw herself off the tower so that she could come back as a ghost to haunt her husband for the rest of his days as vengeance for having an affair on her. It got so bad, these weird experiences were chilling enough on their own, but when people were at the top of the tower, things kind of started to get a little bit violent. People started reporting feeling the sensation of being like shoved towards the edge of the tower when they were on top of it, even when nobody was behind them. And with all of these things combined, Manuel decided to shut it all down. Nobody else is going to the top of the tower anymore. I want nothing to do with this. I want to try to move past this tower as much as possible. And despite the fact that nobody else went up in the tower for the rest of his life, those strange occurrences continued to happen. Again, hearing a woman screaming from the tower and strange growls and noises. Decades after Emmanuel died, the township of Alpine itself actually tried to, in the 1950s, I believe it was, to deconstruct the tower. But after several mysterious deaths of some of the construction workers trying to deconstruct the tower, the project was abandoned and nobody ever tried to deconstruct it since. So today in 2021, the tower is still very much there. And people still go to see it from time to time, trying to get a little bit of a thrill out of it, you know? And some people who've driven to the tower have mentioned to have some weird experiences themselves. To this day, people still claim to see a dark figure walking around the top of the tower. And some people say too that if you stand outside the tower long enough, you'll get a scent of perfume, again, seemingly from out of nowhere. And a lot of people believe it was the perfume that Mrs. Rionda had worn the night of her death. So this next one I have for you guys is one that to me feels ripe for a horror movie to be made out of it, if it hasn't already been done so. This is the story of the pig lady of Hillsborough, New Jersey. So as the story goes, sometime in the early 1900s, there was a farmer and his wife who had a daughter. And when the husband, embraced his daughter and saw her for the first time, he couldn't help himself but remark at what he claimed was the most hideous baby he'd ever seen in his life. To the point where he compared this baby, his baby, which is ironic in my opinion, to one of his pigs on the farm. And he just simply refused to love this child, which is heartbreaking in and of itself. The mother of this child was much more, she embraced the child much more. She's one who more or less single-handedly raised this daughter because the father wanted nothing to do with her. And anytime that he had interactions with her, when she grew up into childhood and even into her teenage years, he was just awful to her. He was absolutely abusive. He always referred to as little pig girl, or he called her my little pig girl. And obviously that's going to have a negative impact on her. Because the farmer was so ashamed of his daughter, it was very rare for him to bring her out into public. So for the most part, she stayed at home, was forced to stay at home. Legends of how ugly this girl was, kind of percolated through the town over time. And it kind of became a bit of a town legend in and of itself, to the point where on one particular day, two teenage boys decided that they were going to mess with this girl inside this house. The pig lady is what they called her. So what these two teenagers did was take a pig's head and walk up to the house and knock on the door, and their intention was to leave the pig's head there. It's kind of like a prank on her, right? The next day, both of those teenage boys' parents filed missing persons reports. So didn't know where they were, started to become worried about them. And for years, the police could never find out where they were. Couldn't find them, couldn't find bodies, couldn't find anything. It seems like they simply just vanished. Several years after that, this pig lady referred to, ended up dying in her early to mid 20s, it seems like. And when the police went to the house to kind of, close up the estate and close up the affairs, what they found in the backyard were shallow graves. One of the shallow graves was for the mother, who had seemed to have died natural causes and by all accounts was given a nice proper burial. Not far from the mother was the grave of the father, who had been decapitated. His head had been cut off, and they were never able to find his head. All they could find was his body in a shallow grave. And not far from him were the two boys that were missing, whose bodies were brutally mutilated before they were buried. So after finding this horrific, scene in the backyard of this house, obviously the police, shut it down. There was no next of kin to give the estate to, and they kind of just, told everybody to leave this place alone. And over time, the place became abandoned. And it kind of went from, being local fact to local legend to local myth. Sometime around 15 or 20 years ago, a car full of teenagers decided to go to the house to check it out. Knew the stories, had heard of the stories of the pig lady, and went to the abandoned property. And as a joke, of course, they all started to get out of the car. But once one of the girls in the car got all the way out, the rest of them jumped back in and drove off and kind of left her there as a bit of a prank, leave her there with the pig lady in the dark. The car came back a couple minutes later. Obviously, again, they just wanted to give her a scare. They just wanted to mess with her. But when they did come back, she was sprinting full tilt down the road towards them. And when they opened the car door, she immediately dove in, and her arms were completely covered in blood, her own blood. Her arms were all cut up to the point where they had to rush her to the hospital. When she got into the car, she was in shock. She couldn't speak at all. In the days afterwards, when she was recovering in the hospital, everybody tried to find out, what happened to you? What caused this? Were you attacked by an animal? Were you attacked by another person? What happened? This girl refused to talk about it. She didn't give any details of what happened. She didn't say what she saw. She refuses to talk about it. And it's a story that's kind of lingered over this ever since. So the story of the pig lady of Hillsborough is still a very, very well-known one. If you go to Hillsborough and ask people about it, they'll tell you this exact story. They know the story of the pig lady pretty well. Proprietary House is a really interesting one because it's one that if you're interested, you can actually go see today in 2021. They still give tours of this place. It's considered a historical site. Now, the story of this goes pretty far back in history, in our nation's history anyway, back to the 1760s. The Proprietary House was originally built for the royal governor of New Jersey in 1764. And what a lot of people don't know about, some American history here is that the Proprietary House that was built for the royal governor, first royal governor that was actually going to live in that house was William Franklin, which is Ben Franklin's son. A lot of people don't know that William Franklin remained loyal to the British before the Revolutionary War, during the war, and even after the war. No matter how much William's father, Ben Franklin, tried to convince him that, the American cause is a worthy one, William refused to listen to that. William believed his father to be a traitor. And he even went to his grave believing that his father was a traitor to Great Britain. So that's just an interesting side part to the story. But If you know anything about Revolutionary War history, you know that New Jersey kind of switched sides multiple times throughout the war. Some points the British occupied it, some points the Americans occupied it, which means that this proprietary house over time had also changed hands several times. Now, what's kind of sad and a little bit dark about this is that both sides, when they were, in occupation of this house, used the cellar as a bit of like a jail or a dungeon for captured soldiers from one side or the other. Now, anybody who's been down in a cellar in a house from the 16 or 1700s, you know that it's pretty cold down there. Even in the summertime, it's cold and it's very dank, right? It's damp. It's very, very wet down there. And so if you're a soldier being held prisoner in there, especially during the winter months, that's not good for your health. And unfortunately, a lot of soldiers that were held down in the cellars ended up dying either from pneumonia or from hypothermia or other related illnesses from being held down there. Over the coming decades and even centuries afterwards, people have reported to have had ghostly encounters with a number of different people in a number of different rooms in the house. Probably the most well-known is the woman in white in the kitchen. A lot of people have said to have seen this ghostly figure of a woman in white who seems to be moving around the kitchen as though people weren't even there in the house. And that a lot of times she stares out the window. It's almost like she's either looking for something or she's waiting for somebody to come back. Other people have reported more violent encounters with spirits in the house. Several people have reported to have felt a sensation when they're in the dining room specifically, that somebody kind of grabbed their neck from behind, like I said, pretty violently and noticeably. And again, when they turn around, there's nobody else in the room with them. Other people have reported to see ghosts down in the cellar area. One of the most interesting ghost stories from the proprietary house, in my opinion, came from the 1950s. During the 1950s, the proprietary house was being used as a boarding home. Before it became a historical building that it is today, it was being used as a boarding home. And a mailman went to deliver a package to the house and knocked on the door, and a little 4-year-old boy answered. And he said, "Hey, I have a package to deliver to somebody. Can you show me to this person's room?" And so the little boy motioned for the mailman to follow him. Followed him up the stairs from the first floor to second floor to the third floor. And that's kind of when the mailman seemed to have lost track of the child and didn't know where the child went. So the mailman simply just started knocking on doors randomly. Yeah, so A, I have this package I need to deliver. Do you know who this person is? But B, anybody know who that kid is, whose child that is? Because the child seems to be wandering around the house and it doesn't seem particularly safe. Nobody in the house knew who the child was. And eventually, by the time he got to the third or fourth door that he knocked on, that's when somebody who'd been living there a long time finally told him there are no children that live in this house. So the mailman was obviously very, very freaked out by that, and stuck to that story, until the day he died. That he had this encounter, that nobody knew who this child was, and he truly believed it to be a ghost. Today, in more modern times, in 2021, like I said, you can still go to this house and get tours of it if you want to, and I think they also book events. So if around Halloween time you're looking to have some kind of an event, you can have dinner down in the cellar if you really want to. So Proprietary House is open for business if you're interested. Several ghost hunting groups have gone to this house over the years, and every single one of them has reported high paranormal activity, is what they call it, with their with their instruments. And again, the biggest hits that they get down in the cellar, in the dining room, and in the kitchen. Those are the three hot spots in the house. Okay, this story of the ghosts of Finn's Point comes from pretty far south in New Jersey, about as far southwest as you can get, all the way down there in Salem County. Now, again, this is another ghost story that's kind of rooted in history. Back in the early 1800s, a fort was built along the Delaware River in New Jersey called Fort Delaware. Appropriate name, I guess. Fort Delaware initially was built to kind of protect the mouth of the Delaware River from any outside invasions, and in particular to protect the city of Philadelphia, since it was a vital hub going back to to 1700s, 1800s, huge population, big city, lots of business being done there. Of course, you'd want to protect one of your major cities as well. Over time, what we saw happen, and again, really especially during the Civil War, this fort was kind of converted into a makeshift prison for captured Confederate soldiers during the war itself. So a lot of times when Confederate soldiers were captured, they were shipped up north to a number of different facilities, and this was one of those facilities that they got shipped up to. Now, because of the notoriously bad conditions that the Confederate soldiers were kept in Fort Delaware, it very quickly developed the reputation of being referred to as the Andersonville of the North. Now, for anybody who knows Civil War history pretty deeply, probably heard of Andersonville. But for those of you who aren't familiar, Andersonville was a notoriously brutal prison down in Georgia in the Confederacy during the Civil War. Somewhere around 13,000 Union soldiers died while imprisoned in Andersonville. And that's just in Andersonville. That's not in any of the other prisons during the war. That was just Andersonville because of the horrible conditions that they were subjected to. They weren't given adequate food, adequate water. They were given inadequate housing that exposed them to the elements in the winter and in the summer. No access to medicine of any kind, no access to doctors of any kind. So a lot of them died either from starvation, from disease, from exposure to the elements and everything in between. Fort Delaware here at Finn's Point, not quite as bad as Andersonville, but still pretty bad. Somewhere around 25 to 2,600 Confederate soldiers lost their lives here at Fort Delaware because, again, of the very, very poor conditions that they were left in. And a lot of these bodies were simply just dumped into mass graves. Now, fast forward into the 1900s, and you have all kinds of stories coming out of here now of people who've experienced ghosts in many different kinds. Some people claim to have seen ghosts kind of marching around the property, again, almost as like human beings weren't even there. Some people reported to see ghosts in and around the mass grave areas. A number of ghost hunting groups have gone to Finn's Point and again have gotten massive hits on their instruments saying that there's a lot of paranormal activity all throughout the place, inside the houses, but even outside too, like I said, pretty close to the mass grave sites. What makes this story also particularly chilling is that in 1994, mass murderer Andrew Cunanan actually killed his fourth victim on the grounds, on the property of Fort Delaware here. He killed one of the groundskeepers in order to steal his truck to try to move on. So pretty grisly past and present for this particular area. And they do ghost tours as well. If you're interested in ever going down here and checking it out, they embrace the fact that there are ghosts down there, and you can do ghost tours late at night if you're interested. So I have two more stories for you guys, and really I saved kind of my favorites for last. I'll tell you guys about the woman in white, and then of course we'll get into the Jersey Devil, because how can you do New Jersey ghost stories without the Jersey Devil? So the woman in white story, again, this is probably one of my favorites because it gives me the chills. This is the one that really gives me the chills. The woman in white story is again, it's one of those ubiquitous ghost stories. It's one that cuts across all cultures, across all times. Every or virtually every culture that has folklore has a story of the woman in white in some way, shape, or form, which is interesting. But on this particular story, what we have here is a story that comes from Newark, New Jersey. And there was a road that a newlywed couple just got married that night. Were driving down this road late at night. It's probably driving maybe a little bit too fast. Maybe they had a little bit to drink. Nobody knows for sure. What we do know is that this car careened off the road and crashed into a tree, killing the couple almost instantly. Now, in the months and years after this incident, many people have reported to have seen a woman in white on the side of the road or walking along the side of the road. And a lot of them even pulled over to see if this woman needed help. And all of them said that in some instances, she would approach the car and do nothing. And in other instances, she simply just ignores the car altogether. And it looks like a woman who is either lost or a woman who kind of is looking for something or searching for something. And a lot of people believe that she is searching for her husband, the one who died next to her in the car when they hit the tree. Now, the most chilling story to me came from two teenage girls driving on the road in the 1970s. Like many of the other motorists who have gone down this road over time, these two teenage girls, again, said that they saw a woman emerge from the side of the road and naturally stopped to see if this woman needed help. It's late at night. It's clear that it's not normal for a woman to be alone or anybody to be alone on the side of a road. So they pulled over and rolled their window down and asked her if she needed help. And what both of them claim is that this woman walked up to the side of the car, almost to the point where she was about this close to them in the window, stared at them blankly, and then opened her mouth as though she was screaming, but no sound came out. Now, that was obviously enough to freak both of them out. And the driver immediately gunned the accelerator. The car went screeching down the road. And after about a half mile or so down the road, they stopped to kind of collect themselves, try to figure out what just happened. What did we just see? And they both agreed that they really couldn't say what it was that happened. They don't know, their mind starts to try to rationalize it, right? So they're saying to themselves, well, maybe she was just, really panicked or really injured and didn't know how to express herself. So immediately these two girls contact the police and they say, we need to go back. We need to see if this woman needs help. So the two girls led the police back to the area, to the exact spot they claimed, the exact spot where 100% definitively sure this is where we saw her. And after investigating the area for a good 45 minutes, the police came back to the two girls and said, this better not be a prank because there are no signs of any person being out here. There are no footprints. There's no path through the grass. There's no disturbed plants in the area. Nothing has come through here in a long time. But the two girls stuck to their story. They truly believe what happened scared the daylights out of them. And even years later afterwards, they were interviewed by a local newspaper about this story. It's kind of like a long-term follow-up to it. And both girls stuck to the story. They said it was the scariest moment of their lives. And neither one of them will drive down this road late at night because of it. So our last ghost story of the day, of course, is the rock star of ghost stories in New Jersey, right? It's the story of the Jersey Devil. And like all good ghost stories, it's anchored in historical fact. So let's talk first about the legend itself. For anybody who might not be familiar, I know that this is like an old bedtime story in New Jersey at this point, but maybe for anybody who hasn't heard the story, let's go over the story real quick, and then let's talk about the historical background to it and where it kind of came from. So the story of the Jersey Devil, the legend of the Jersey Devil, revolves around a family called the Leeds family that lived down in what's Leeds Point, New Jersey today. It's just outside of Atlantic City. It's still there. The story revolves around a woman named Jane Leeds who had 12 children over the course of her life. And that alone would be a nightmare for me. Having 12 children, my heart went out to this poor woman. She had to have been overwhelmed. So Jane Leeds was overwhelmed, right? Jane Leeds, 12 children was more than enough as far as she was concerned. And she really, really did not want any more children. Well, I mean, of course, as the story goes, Jane Leeds eventually found herself pregnant with her 13th child. And that was more than she could handle. Jane Leeds became so angry and frustrated with the fact that she was now pregnant with a 13th child that she cursed the sky and she cursed the child from within, saying that she hopes this child emerges as some kind of a horrible creature. Well, fast forward 9 months or so. And Jane Leeds goes into labor during a really horrible thunderstorm, not unlike the thunderstorm that we had just last night. And of course, as the creature begins to emerge from inside of her, the whole house starts to shake. Creature eventually comes out that looked very much like the picture you see right here. Everybody who was a witness in the room claims that the creature that emerged had the head of a goat, had the leathery wings of a bat, cloven hooves, and a spiked or barbed tail. And that once this creature emerged from her, it flew around the room, kind of panicky for a few seconds before flying out the window and disappearing into the pine barrens. Over the next few weeks, many people from inside the town got their dogs, got their guns, and tried to hunt this creature down so it wouldn't be, a nuisance to them in the future and they didn't have to worry about it. A lot of them who went on that hunt claimed that they had heard screams of this creature in the middle of the night. Some of them claimed to have seen it. They tracked it through the woods for several days, following mainly the bodies of the maimed animals that it had killed and eaten along its journey through the woods. But nobody was ever able to find it. Nobody was ever able to kill this creature. So as the story goes, the creature still exists in New Jersey to this day, haunting the pine barrens all along the coastline. So there's the legend. Let's talk now about the historical fact and how the two kind of mesh together a little bit. So what's interesting about this is that there really was a Leeds family down in southern New Jersey outside of Atlantic City, and that's actually where Leeds Point got its name from. So it's a real family. The family had 9 children, not 13, but it's again a historical fact here. So what we see here is an individual. Can't remember his first name now off the top of my head, but obviously last name was Leeds. He and his wife, who did have the 9 children together, were part of the Quaker family, group of Quakers who lived down in New Jersey in the early 1700s. What he did for work, what he did for his job was to print an almanac. And this is something he did on a monthly basis, and that's what the majority of their income was from, was him printing this almanac. Now, over time, what he started to do here was to add in some astrology to his almanacs. And if you know anything about the Quaker, Quaker beliefs, especially going back to this time in the early 1700s, Quakers would not have been on board with astrology being added to their, to their almanacs. So after several warnings, the community eventually ostracized them, kind of kicked them out and said, "You're not welcome to be a part of our community anymore." And that's when, I think his name was Daniel Leeds, really started to lean in now to the occult and to astrology. Now that he was kind of freed, quote unquote, from being a part of the Quaker community, it meant now he was free to print whatever he wanted. At some point, Daniel Leeds passed on the family business to his son, Titan. And Titan Leeds took over as now the printer of the almanac and the almanac business. So not only did his son continue with the astrology, but what his son Titan also did was started to print the family crest at the top of the almanac every time he printed. Now, what was in the family crests were creatures that are called wyverns. They're mythological creatures. If you're unfamiliar, a wyvern was a dragon that walked around on 2 legs, had wings, not dissimilar to what you see right here with the Jersey Devil, and had a spiked or forked tail, depending. So now we kind of starting to see the history, mesh together with the legends. So let's close the circle now. At some point in the 1730s or 1740s, Titan Leeds became a bit of a rival of Benjamin Franklin. And there were 2 big reasons for this. First, because Titan printed almanacs, Ben Franklin saw him as a bit of a business rival, because at this point, Ben Franklin was just starting to get his own almanac online, Poor Richard's Almanac. But probably even more to the point here, as time went on, Titan Leeds became very, very pro-British. As we got closer and closer to the Revolutionary War, Titan Leeds, really started to print a lot of pro-British stuff inside of his almanac. And that is really what seemed to be the trigger for Ben Franklin. Once Titan Leeds became very pro-British, Ben Franklin kind of singled him out as a target. And Ben Franklin started to write a lot of satirical works about Titan Leeds without actually naming him. And he referred to him as the Leeds Devil, and hurled all these accusations at him, from he's pro-British to he prints astrology in his almanacs. He believes in the occult and the dark and in demonology and things like that. And that's kind of where that term Leeds Devil came from. It came from Ben Franklin kind of writing about him in satirical works. The term Jersey Devil itself wasn't actually used, if you can believe it, until the early 1900s. A newspaper reporter in the early 1900s began to refer to this legend not as the Leeds Devil, which had been known all the way up to that point in our New Jersey history, but as the Jersey Devil overall. And once the newspaper printed the story of the Jersey Devil, that's when it kind of changed names, and that's when it really kind of took on a lot of this. So that is where the history of the Jersey Devil, or the Leeds Devil, kind of comes together with the legend of the Jersey Devil that you and I are so familiar with today. Last little bit I have here for you guys is actually the Leeds House. That's me in the left-hand corner of the picture, because the Leeds House is still privately owned. There's still people who actually live in the house, so I had to shadily pull over the side of the road and snap a couple quick pictures, because apparently people do this all the time and it drives them nuts. So I didn't want to be that guy. But that is the Leeds House. That's still very much there today in 2021, and that's the Leeds House that the legend of the Jersey Devil came from. The one where Jane Leeds had her 13th child, and the creature flew out the window, and that's where it is, down in Leeds Point, New Jersey. And that's it. So do you guys have any questions for me?